Me pusieron en mute. Buenísimo. So I think we can go ahead and get started. So this is our ninth edition of Landa Talks, a space where we bring in experienced consultants or fractional executives to share a bit of their journey, tips and tricks of the trade, and give us some advice so we can learn and like improve our fractional career. So today I'm happy to host Javier Ramirez. He's obviously a fractional executive with a long experience, also the founder of Quota.io. And he also brings in a very important skill set in terms of sales, which is very important, and we'll cover that. And also a big advocate for fractional work and independent work in general. So thanks for joining, Javier. And if you could share a bit about your background and your experience, that'd be a great starting point.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, Pedro, thanks for having me, and thank you guys for putting together, this initiative, because I've been trying to scream from the rooftop about fractional work for the last couple of years, and I'm glad other people have caught on to the experience. But my experience is broken down in two chapters, or maybe three. The first one is finance. So I started my career in finance. I was a credit analyst and then a sales and trading individual at Goldman Sachs, which was very exciting, very unique, and very intense. And I realized I didn't want to do that the rest of my life. And I also realized that I wanted to be in a more client-facing role, that I could have a little bit of creativity in building structures and processes. And that brought me to B2B SaaS. And so I transitioned to the world of tech in 2013. I went to a small company at the time that was called Zenefits. And that company eventually became a unicorn. It grew aggressively. It went from $0 to $80 million in sales in about 2.5 years. And I was lucky enough to be one of the early sales guys there to grow the business and then eventually end up running enterprise sales. From there, I went to Rippling, which is a company that's now worth $13 billion. It's a huge HR product in the United States market and actually international. I was the first sales hire to sort of build and scale the entire go-to-market strategy from scratch. And then in 2018, I decided to make the switch to go to a safer company, or what I thought was a safer company. I went to WeWork. And so in 2018, WeWork was growing like crazy, right? I was the director of enterprise sales for the Southeast of the United States. That brought me to Miami. And it was a lot of fun until it stopped. The music stopped in 2020 when the company failed to go public. And then at that point, we had to lay off our entire team. We had to restructure most of the go-to-market function and sales. And I decided that it was time for me to leave. And at that point, I started doing fractional work full time, which I'm sure you're going to want to know about. But that's a high-level summary of everything that I've done in the last 12 or 13 years.
That's amazing, and thanks for sharing. And yeah, we'll get into the whole journey. Just real quick, before I forget, we'll leave a space of around 15 to 20 minutes of questions at the end. So you can chip in then, but if you have any questions during the conversation, you can just leave them in the chat and we'll cover them. But yeah, I guess tell us a bit about your journey into fractional work. And usually the way we ask this question is, how did you land your first client, right? What was that first experience like? Was it a referral? Did you go full outbound? Tell us a bit about that.
So I'm going to answer the question a little bit differently, because one of the things that I learned in finance was to always hedge your risk. And so when I think about hedging my risk, I think about not putting all my income into one basket. And so if I take a couple of steps back, actually in 2018, I got my first consulting client on the side. It's very common in the United States that most people that are successful at something that they're doing, they get contacted through LinkedIn a lot for full-time positions. And what I did is every time I got an inbound for people asking me like, hey, do you want to come and be our VP of sales? I would take the call and say like, hey, listen, I'm not available for a full-time gig, but this is how I can help you. And so I would try to figure out how to structure, some time that I could give to the company, but keeping in mind that I have a big impact in their organization. And so for sales, a lot of companies want to change their velocity in sales. They want to shorten their sales cycles. They want to increase growth. Or maybe a lot of founders don't know what to do after they've sold up to a certain point and then go from there. So in reality, I know we're going to talk about this eventually, but there's a big differentiation between consulting and fractional. And so for consulting, I received inbound demand and I sort of converted that into a side hustle, if you want to think about it that way. But going into directly answering your question, in 2020, I took a step back and did sort of like a self-reflection to say, like, what am I good at and what have I done throughout my career? And for me, it was very obvious that I have gone through 3 unicorns in the United States that were hyper growing, that had done a lot of good things, and a lot of people wanted my experience. So what I did was do what I did for a full-time job, was like I pick up the phone and I started calling people and I started asking them, what do they need help with? And this is a big mistake a lot of people will do, because a lot of people will call people and tell them, like, help me. Right. And I do that in the opposite way. I would call companies and say, like, hey, listen, how are you doing? How are you doing in sales? And if you were to work with somebody, or like if there's something specific that you need help with, what is that? And so I started understanding different patterns, and I realized companies usually have 2 problems in sales. One is a top of the funnel problem, which is like they can't get enough leads. And the second one is a closing problem, which is they can't close enough business. I'm extremely good at the second one. And so I started then telling people, like, well, listen, like, I'm available if you want to figure something out. I would love to see if I can help you. And I started then building a pipeline, and I closed my first deal in the middle of the pandemic. And feel free to ask me more, but I can share more details or tell you about the story. But that's how I got my first real fractional client.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I guess my follow up would be, obviously now you've been doing it like full time for a long time. So if you can walk us through that journey, that'd be very interesting. Yeah, from the first client to your practice today and what your offering looks like.
Yeah. So listen, there's one thing that I want to share with you guys that for me was really interesting. So I started doing consulting, and it was just me. It was Javier, Ramirez Consulting, right? And one of the things that I started to notice is that if you're selling to tech companies, like who my buyer was, is that I wanted to have a higher perception. A higher perception would allow me to charge more and to essentially like get more business. There were 3 things that I did in order to start growing the practice. Number one, I built a brand, and the brand's called Cuota. It's spelled with a C because that's how you write it in Spanish. And 50% of my business is in Latin America, 50% is in the United States. So it works for both markets. And also, the name of the company is exactly what I'm trying to solve and help companies to do, which is hit their quota. The second thing that I did is build a nice website. And then the third thing that I did is obviously build an amazing presentation. So when I speak with someone, it's not just like Javier sitting in his apartment, kind of trying to help me with sales. I have a higher value perception where, people think of me as like, man, this guy's done this before. He knows what he's doing. But I'm also selling myself. And if I can't sell myself, like, how are people going to trust me that I can help them sell themselves? Right. And so for me, one of the first things that I did was I knew that it was very hard to scale by going one-to-one, because it takes a lot of time. So if I were to go to like every single company and do outbound and ask them if they need help, it would take me a long time to scale. So I started thinking about different distribution channels. And obviously I know this because I'm in sales, but I thought about like, how can I find channel partnerships? A partner where they can give me access to many companies. And for me, the obvious answer for that was venture capital funds. And so I went to venture capital funds. I started asking them the same questions that I've asked anyone. And what I started trying to understand is that every fund is extremely good and has a high capacity in operations, anything technical, and particularly engineering and product. Not a lot of funds have the expertise that I have in the commercial side of the business. So for a fund, it was very exciting to talk to someone with my experience because I was helping them give a resource to their companies, and their companies were essentially elevating their value by selling more, which essentially would help the venture capital fund improve their investment or valuation, right? So when I started working with funds, it became a lot easier because funds will tell someone, hey, this is Javier. He's an expert in SaaS. He's also working with us. And if you guys know anything about venture capital, if the person that gives you the money to build your dream is telling you to do something, you go and do it, right? And so that was a very successful model for me. And then the best thing, which I think we're going to talk about, or we should talk about, is picking the clients that I knew I was going to be very successful at. Because the second way I can be very successful in building a different distribution channel was referrals. Well, as of today, like any referral that I get usually closes. Like it had 100% close rate because founders talk to each other. So if one founder tells another founder like, hey, listen, I work with Javier and it was an extremely successful conversation, or it was an extremely successful engagement, they're likely going to do it. And so, through doing that over the last 3.5 years, I've been able to work with over 50 companies in B2B SaaS, split evenly between the United States and Latin America. And it's been the best. The best thing I've been able to do is to diversify my top of the funnel, to not put all my eggs in one basket, and always find a balance between working with clients and prospecting. Because when a lot of fractional workers or consultants fail, it's when they don't have sufficient pipeline and they get to a point where they run out of business, and that's when they go and find a full-time job and leave the entire industry.
That's very interesting, and I guess while we're on the whole subject of diversification, I wanted to ask you about today, and obviously it takes a while to get there. What does your offering look like, right? I know you have some online courses and some other sources of income, so that'd be also interesting to know as a potential path, right, for other consultants.
Yeah. So I'm glad you asked that because in the game of consulting or fractional work, we're trading time for money. And so we are the product. If we don't sit in front of a computer, we don't make money. And what I've realized is like we all go into fractional businesses to find a better quality of life. But in reality, you can be in a situation where you're not having a quality of life because you end up working more. In many situations, I put myself in especially at the beginning. I was working with like 6, 7, 8 clients at once, and I would essentially structure my agreements in 2 ways. I would do consulting, which is I'll give you a couple hours a week, and we can fix something together, and we'll do a minimum of 3-month agreement. And I would do fractional work, which is I'll give you a day a week or more, and we have to solve for a specific outcome. But then in that scenario, like it's a 6-month minimum agreement. And when you have those combination of like structures that are going in between, you're working 12 hours because you have to prepare for the calls. You have to be, kind of doing pipeline reviews. You have to always source new business. And the problem with that is that you're not creating the life that you really thought you were going to create when you went in to do fractional work. And so one of the things that I started doing was I started to actively talk about what I was doing on LinkedIn. And a lot of people started reaching out. And for a very long time, I was trying to find virality in LinkedIn, whatever that means. But I was just trying to go viral like every other TikToker wants to go viral nowadays, right? And the most successful post that I've ever had, which was a post that had over 30,000 impressions, was a post that I told people that I retired at 33. And people are like, how the hell did you retire at 33? And how did you make so much money? And I told them, well, I'm doing fractional work. And from that post till like today, I've talked to about 105 people that have called me or messaged me and like booked time on my calendar to tell me like, help me understand how do you do fractional work. And so I realized, I mean, this is not scalable because again, I'm trading my time for money. And at that point, what I realized is I built what's called the fractional operating system. And it's a course that you guys can all access. It's only $150 and it shows my entire playbook, my entire operating model from beginning to end for people to be able to do the same thing that I'm doing and have actually a guide. And I wish I had that 3.5 years ago because I made a lot of mistakes. But now this course like essentially acts as a funnel for me because people can access the course, can kind of join the community, and be purchasing that as I'm working on other clients, and I don't have to be in front of my computer in order to do that. And so along before that, I actually did a couple other courses because I realized also a lot of companies were doing or having the same problems. Every company doesn't know how to structure a good sales call, and it's in Spanish and it's in English, and I put it out there and I shared it with the world, and it's also a lead magnet because if people buy the course and they like it enough, they call you and they say like, hey, listen, I love what you're doing, I need you to come and teach my entire team how to do this and help me like build an engagement.
That's very interesting. And just a quick follow up there. So it's a pre-recorded course, and that's how you're able to scale it.
Mm-hmm. So it's a pre-recorded course, which I use a system called Kajabi, which all of you guys can kind of access the same thing. And in that course, I mean, what's important is the material that I'm sharing and also the playbooks that I created. Because a lot of you probably are wondering, like, what's the right price for a contract? How do I build a contract? How do I build my perceived value? How do I sell? And so what I've done is like there are pre-recorded videos that you can watch, and you can essentially take that information and apply it to your business and start, kind of making more money or start improving how you project manage an engagement.
Interesting, interesting. Um, I have well, we touched on this earlier, but I feel we've been like switching between different terminology. So I just wanted to ask you point blank, what do you see, like, how do you understand consulting as opposed to fractional work? I'm curious about your perspective on it because I know in the industry it tends to get blurry.
Thank you for asking that. I really appreciate it because they're not the same. Actually, I would tell you there's a third category, right? There's freelance, there's consulting, and there's fractional. Freelance, I see it sort of as like I need help with a very simple thing, right? And that may be something that you get paid a specific hourly amount for, and that usually may take you, a certain period of time that's like in the weeks, right? It may be like a 1 or 2 week process. So, for example, like help me build a job description, right? And I never do those because that's like, in my personal opinion, that's like a low perception of value, and I have a lot more to bring to the table. So I don't want to get into the freelance market because for me, I would have to do so many like freelance gigs in order for me to make the money that I want to make. The second category for me, consulting, is it has a higher value perception. It's something that usually can take a couple of months, and it can have a specific outcome, but not necessarily. And so I'll explain. For example, in sales, somebody tells me like, "Hey, I want to hire you for consulting." I think about like they just want my brain, they want my experience, and they just need me to go and tell them how to do certain things, right? I'm not managing people. I'm not joining like leadership meetings. And we can do a loose contract, which may be anywhere between 2 to 3 months. And obviously, like that's more expensive than freelance, but it's less expensive than fractional. Now, when you think about fractional work, fractional is almost as close as interim, which is actually a fourth category. Fractional work, I see it as it's a longer term engagement. You have a specific outcome. So, for example, if in sales somebody asks me like, "Okay, I'm going to hire you, but I need you to actually improve my conversion rates from 25% to 50%." And so, throughout the duration of those 6 months, you're consistently solving to accomplish that particular metric, right? And on top of that, I give them about a day a week or more. But most importantly, like you sort of have to do some management too, So there are junior salespeople on the team. For anyone that's doing product, there might be product people. For anyone that's doing marketing, there might be marketing people that you have to coach and help. And so that's a more sophisticated engagement because it requires you to spend more time. And that's why I also differentiate them between my offers, because one is way more expensive and way more involved than the other, which is consulting, which is less involved and less expensive. Did that answer your question, Pedro?
It did. It did.
Yeah.
And I guess it brought up an interesting point now that I think about it, because obviously, whichever modality you take, and even in your diverse offering, you build your whole practice on your like very specific experience and skill set, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to ask you about that. Like, how do you see? What's the importance of niching down or finding this 1% skill, as you call it? And yeah, I'd like to just get your general thoughts on it.
Thank you for asking that. Um, when I started doing consulting, one of the things that I realized is that a lot of people hated consultants, and they hated them because they would come in and not do a lot of work and not have like a big impact. And you happen to be the 45-year-old guy that has a couple of kids, and there's this bad perception about us, right? And when I started realizing like how can I make a big impact, how can I work with people that I'm actually gonna like move the needle like significantly, what I realized is I have to really do an introspection and find what I'm excellent at, right? And I call it the 1% skill, and that's something that I branded for the course. But the 1% skill is like the one thing that you're 1% at, that regardless of the environment, regardless of the company, regardless of the industry, you're going to be able to figure that out. And I think it's really important because, as I mentioned earlier, if you don't do an engagement that's right for you, or that you can actually solve, or that you can be successful at, nobody's going to refer you. And so now they're going to put you in the category of like the failed consultant. And there's many of those, right? So for me, I qualify out more than I qualify in. And what that means is that I make sure that every engagement that I'm going to involve in is something that I can solve. Because specifically in tech, right, there's a perception that some companies think that they have a sales problem, but in reality, what they do have is a product problem. I can't fix a product problem, right? And so if I'm going to get myself into a situation where I'm not going to be successful, that's a huge, huge, huge risk for myself, because I can't not afford for someone to say like, I worked with Javi and it didn't work. That is more detrimental, and it goes against you so much harder than the opposite, because you might get one or two referrals from like every project, but if you do one bad deal or one bad engagement, it's going to spread like wildfire, and I can't afford that. So I think that people get to the situation where they just take engagements because they need money, or because they haven't been able to kind of close a deal. And that's a risky situation to be, because you might get yourself into an engagement where you're not solving for your niche. And it happens too often.
That's very interesting, and I think I'd be doing a disservice if I didn't ask. And I know this may be getting in the weeds a little bit in terms of sales. Is how did you get to your ICP, and how do you think about that, like ideal customer profile? Was that something you had in mind already? Did you change that over time as you had more calls or more projects? And what's the overall importance of it? I think that's very important for everyone.
This is a great question, Pedro, because what a lot of people don't realize, and at least from my perspective, is that you're building a business. And so I'm advising all these companies to go through a sales process. And what I tell them first is go talk to 100 people and validate your product. And that's what I did. Right. So like for myself, like what I try to understand is, what do companies need help with? And when I started talking, I mean, obviously I spent a long time in B2B SaaS. And so I knew for a fact that that was going to be the industry that I was going to operate in. But my question was going to be, what stage within B2B SaaS can I be really successful and really exciting? And what I started to uncover as I talked to early stage founders through introductions or through, kind of me reaching out, is that most founders that are the brilliant minds that start companies are the ones that are very technical but are not very commercial. And these are the guys that actually start doing the selling. And they get lucky because they build a good product or because they talk to the right people or get the right introductions. But there comes a point in time where in order for them to scale and to find that velocity, they need to set up an infrastructure, and they need someone that's an expert that has done it before that can come in. But also, because the VP of sales is the number one hire that most companies fail at the most, I also realized like that they are de-risking themselves by saying like, hey, let me actually bring someone in that I don't have to do a full commitment on. They can get me to this place. They can help me fix, kind of the infrastructure and put my company in a good stage. And I'm more likely to be successful in bringing in the right VP of sales. But I've also like found some growth without having to increase my burn rate to a dramatic place. Right. So, I mean, I've shared a lot, but I think that the main hypothesis that I was operating from is the fact that you have to think about this as a business. A lot of people do fractional work or consulting work in a transitionary phase. They're going in between jobs and all those types of things. Like for me, branding it and thinking about it as a business allowed me to really find that niche and say, like, I know for a fact that companies that have 2 million in ARR in B2B SaaS need me. And companies that speak Spanish, because I'm from Puerto Rico and I can, kind of share the playbook with them in Spanish, or companies in the United States absolutely need me because they can't figure this out without me. And that's how I found my ICP.
That's amazing. That's amazing, and thanks for sharing. I don't. I want to open it up to questions. I'll just ask my last question, and and I promise everyone will get a chance. So my last question is, if you were to give one piece of advice to someone starting on their like consulting or fractional, or let's call it independent journey, what would that piece of advice be, and why?
I mean, the first thing they should do is buy the course. Uh, I mean, it's an easy answer, man. But no, in reality, I think that, no joking, like you should probably try to find someone that has done it before. I didn't know like anyone that was doing fractional work in a full-time capacity in the way that I'm doing it today. And I wish I would have like avoided a lot of mistakes, because I have to be honest with you. At the beginning, I took a couple of engagements that I shouldn't have taken. And I was like, oh, cool, these guys want to work with me. I'll give you an example. I worked for a company that was selling some visual cameras into supermarkets. I have no idea how to sell to supermarkets. I have no idea how like supermarkets work. But I was like, the overconfident guy coming out of WeWork, just trying to like help people solve their problems. And it wasn't a successful engagement. And they told me, like, listen, like the CEO and I had a conversation a month into our 3-month engagement, and told me, like, listen, man, it's not working out. And also, we probably set the wrong expectations, because outbound takes a lot of time to set up when you're doing prospecting into other companies. And in a month's time, like you can't solve for that. And then the second thing, which I'll stress, which I just talked about, is you have to like actually say no to things that you can't fix. Like pick the right problems that you can bring, kind of the right solution to the table, because otherwise your business is going to fail very fast, because everyone's going to talk. Founders talk to each other. In B2B SaaS, it's a small industry. If anyone's doing any other types of industries, everyone talks to each other. And you have to make sure that you're solving for success consistently, because it's a business. And then the last thing I'll say is, this is not easy. Like for anyone that thinks that just going and doing fractional work is going to make them $500,000 right off the bat, listen, you might be able to do it, but it takes work, it takes dedication, it takes building the right systems, it takes selecting the right accounts, and building a process. And you have to be okay with that, but you also have to be okay with using different muscles that you haven't maybe used in the past. I had no idea anything about like social media marketing, ads, building courses, when I left my last job. But it's something that I've had to learn, and it takes a different, strength from you. So I know that wasn't one, that was more like three. But the fractional operating system is the solution to all your problems.
No, thanks for that. That was amazing. So I'll open up to questions. I think Fanny already has one in the chat. So
Yes.
go
That's a
ahead,
good
Fanny.
question.
Thanks, Pedro. Thank you, Javier, for the presentation. Very clear and inspiring. The first question I put in the chat is about the pricing. Do you have, and I'm interested about like how it was at the beginning and how it is now. Were you very strict at the beginning with the price list or not? And how is it today?
That's a good question, Fanny. I think it was actually the opposite. At the beginning, I was just testing out the market, right? So, for what I did was I took a salary for a VP of sales, and I took the base salary and divided it over 12 months, and said like, okay, if this person is going to work 40 hours a month, and I'm going to work, let's say, half of that, then I would like half, kind of that salary. That was like the basic way that I came up with it. Um, and one thing that I want to be very, very, very strict about is like I don't do hourly, because like what I feel like most people fail on is like, hey, yeah, I'll do $250 an hour, or $150 an hour, whatever it is. But again, it's about perception. If you're being treated as an hourly worker, it's a different relationship than when you say like, listen, if you want to work with me, it's 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, whatever the dollar amount you come up with on a monthly basis, because this is a legit relationship that you and I are going to get involved in, and I'm going to help you solve for that. Um, what I do differentiate is consulting versus fractional pricing, right? And so fractional is more expensive. Like fractional is almost like, you're getting a fraction of my experience that's now more sophisticated. Because as I mentioned, in fractional, you're actually doing a little bit of management. And so what I try to explain to them is when you do get my fractional experience, you're not only getting, kind of sales management, you're getting sales operations, you're getting sales enablement, you're getting, kind of sales strategy, versus like in consulting, you're just getting a handful of those. So again, just like building any type of business, I have, a pricing chart, where it compares what's included versus what's not included. And the more expensive one obviously has more check marks than the one that has less check marks, which is the cheaper pricing.
Okay, I have another question.
Please.
Sorry, how about doing like some missions in partnership with others? Is it a way that you think is strategic to scale your possible impact and workflow without having to work double?
Absolutely, as long as you have good chemistry with that individual, as long as that individual has the same work ethic and the same, kind of sophistication that you have. I've done this where it has not gone well. It's a different situation than like maybe you've worked with this person in the past at an old job. And it's very different because when you go into a fractional, kind of engagement, and let's say you have a couple of different clients, people can get overwhelmed, and people underperform in those situations. And if you're the one recommending it, again, think about the referral. You're putting yourself in a riskier situation, because if that person doesn't perform, it came through you, and it's not their fault. It's Fanny recommended her or him. And so I think it works really well to scale, and it's good to have like different people in different disciplines. Because, for example, I'm not an expert in marketing. So if someone asks me to do anything related to marketing, I will be the first one to say no. And I will be the first one to say like, listen, I can help you with sales, but I can bring in someone that I highly trust and recommend in marketing. But again, if they're vetted by you.
Good. That's good for the Landa community. Thank you.
Exactly.
Thank you. Go ahead, Juan Andres.
Hi, Javier. One question. When you're doing fractional, are there like some requirements that you give to the companies in order for you to be able to work with them? For example, like if you need for me to succeed, or if I were to succeed helping you, then I would need, I don't know, like 3 sales reps, think
Mhm.
like that kind of requirements, and how do you filter if this is going to happen or isn't going to happen? Like, how do you know if with the resources that the companies are giving you, if you are going to be successful or not? And then a follow-up question to that is, when you start working with the company
Mhm.
and then you realize that one of the resources is not working for you, I mean, they're not giving you the result that you're looking for, how do you handle that?
Those are two very good questions, Juan. Thank you. Number one, when you work with a company and when you're going through the sales process, it's a two-way street. You have to treat it as almost as like an interview process. So you have to make sure that as I mentioned earlier, I qualify out more than I qualify in. And so when I think about the resources for me to be successful, I try to not rely too much on the internal resources. But for example, if I'm going in as a fractional VP of sales, I don't need 3 VPs. I need the entire team, or 3 AEs. I need the entire team, right? And so what I think is most important for me is that I have buy-in from leadership to make sure that they're actually going to listen to what I'm going to tell them. Because a lot of situations, like I've noticed, and I walked away from deals where through the evaluation, what I try to implement also is sort of like a diagnosis. So I have a meeting that's a 1 hour meeting where we go through the entire sales metrics and we sort of have like a feedback session. In that situation, I always try to give open feedback, and I study reactions and I do hard recommendations to see how people react. Um, if I see people like reacting in a negative way where they're not going to implement what I'm going to say, I know that's the deal that I need to walk away from, because you're not going to be successful, right? Um, on many situations, I've worked with sales enablement, right? Because in many situations, I walk in, there's a sales problem, and I can bring in my own sales enablement partner, or I can use theirs. But if theirs is not good enough, or theirs is not, kind of reacting to what we're trying to fix, that's a problem. And so I want them to be part of that diagnosis or like that analysis meeting as well, right? And you have to make sure that you meet all those people as you're going through the process. Again, just like an interview process, because at the beginning, when I started doing this, I was like, oh yeah, we're gonna work with the sales enablement person. But everyone has their own methodology, and you're always seen as the outsider. So like if you don't have that leadership buy-in that's helping you from the top, it's gonna be really hard for you to like overcome all of that. Right. And so I think your second question is tricky, because if you haven't been successful in the short period of time that you've been working with the company, your credibility automatically decreases, right? And you have to make sure that you're signing up for a situation that you're going to be successful, most importantly, but also that the resources are believing in you and that you're involved in meetings. Again, when you're doing fractional work, I'm involved in sales leadership meetings. I participate, I talk, I come in and kind of give recommendations. And you have to build relationships with people the same way that you build relationships in your full-time jobs. So that's why like you guys have to be very careful with the fractional work, because the fractional work also consumes a lot of your time. And so Fanny, if you're thinking about scale, if you have 2 fractional clients, it's tough to scale. You need to essentially start building your own team of people that are going to come and operate, and sort of like deploy them into the projects. And you focus on a strategic, like, high level thinking work. But again, Juan, I think that for you, it's like, if you don't have leadership buy-in, it's almost like a failed experiment. I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, please let me know.
It does. Thanks.
Very nice. Do you have any other takers? No one? When we had one with Tito, we used to have a shot clock. But okay, Fanny is
Yes,
back.
I have another question about the personal branding. So you were saying that especially tech companies will be happy to buy like a best seen brand, and so not necessarily just someone. How do you manage it? Because I've been looking at your social, especially on LinkedIn, and so I can see that you present yourself as Javier, but you also have Cuota. So how do you manage in between these two brands? And I'm asking that because I find myself like kind of struggling with the idea of like being really on the front scene with my face and with my name. Like it's not something I'm really at ease at. I don't use much social, but also like I've been doing that for 6 months, and I totally understand that if I don't do it more, the deal flow is gonna be really weak. So I'm trying to design something that's honest with myself, and I'm really curious about how do you do it between the two brands.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and actually I have two answers for you, because you have an underlying question there about kind of putting yourself in the social community and doing prospecting via producing content. But I think that on your first question, for me it's very easy. It's like, I operate under the Cuota brand, but I'm the CEO, right? So it's like Javier is the CEO of Cuota, and with the expectation that I eventually wanted to build a bigger brand. So when you think about scale, that's something that I think about consistently, right? So Cuota had online courses. At one point, we had a marketplace. At one point, we had a boot camp. And so we've done different things, kind of through our brand. And I think that having a brand has allowed me to experiment with all these different things and actually bring people that are operating under the Cuota brand. So actually, going back to your question from earlier, when I bring in a marketing individual, I'm white labeling them through Cuota. And so the perception from the company's side is like, oh, I'm actually hiring a company, right? Which is like a little bit higher perception value than Javier Ramirez Consulting, right? And so I think that has, kind of worked really well because like, just people like prefer saying like, hey, I hired Cuota, and eventually like I want it to be a consulting practice that has more people and that's not just me. So again, that goes back to my hypothesis, or like what I originally tried to engineer. One of the things that you said, which is like, how do you manage that on social, and how do you like put yourself out there? Be careful with this, because a lot of people, what they do, and I've helped a couple of people take off on their consulting or fractional businesses, and they spend too much time writing on LinkedIn or paying attention to LinkedIn. And it takes a lot of time for you to build, that audience that eventually is going to come and buy from you. The best way I can tell you to think about this, Fanny, is if you do social media management tasks, you're going to get social media management income. If you do sales tasks, you're going to get sales income. If you do consulting tasks, you're going to get consulting income. And so you have to pick your battles, especially, I don't know, at what stage are you, by the way? Did you just start? Are you?
I've been doing that for maybe 6 months.
Okay.
Like pretty quietly. And at the beginning, I thought I was like gonna focus on my existing experience ecosystem, which is the impact investing sector. And now I kind of found a new niche, which is more the creative community.
Nice.
It came out pretty naturally through my like personal contacts, and it looks like there is such a strong need, and it is like some way like an ecosystem where I can like I can scale quickly because I can reuse the same tools and the same methodologies. And as you said, it's a very connected ecosystem. So people talk to each other. Everyone has the same problems. And so I kind of focus more on strategy and finance management.
Okay.
For them. So it's pretty new. I'm just like now in the process of, okay, I've done it for 6 months. It's working pretty well. I want to see how it can scale. I want to test it. And so I'm thinking, right, it's like how to build the personal brand. Is it like something very general, like impact and creativity? Or should I focus really like on one niche and try it all? Understanding that I will always have my existing network in the impact investing ecosystem. So I am in this.
Yeah. I listen, I think there's nothing wrong with you creating a brand that you can repurpose if you decide to have a different niche down the road, which I've done, right? So what you don't want to do is, one of the mistakes that I made is that at one point you logged into my website and you're like, I'm overwhelmed. this guy's a consultant, a trainer, a course creator, a recruiter, marketplace, and which, by the way, like there's many services that you guys can upsell or package so you can make your contracts bigger. It's part of the fractional operating system. But I think that if you create a brand behind which you operate on, I think that you'll be really successful, because that brand, you represent the brand at the end of the day, but the brand is there to get that brand equity and sort of that credibility from people that are going to buy from, instead of Fannie Villar's, consulting, it might be Creativity Inc. or whatever you decide to call it, right? So again, the only thing I'll tell you to be very careful with is, like, I know people that have been doing consulting work for 6 months and they're on LinkedIn all day and they have no business. And they're like updating their resumes because the next thing they have to do is go find a job.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Martin.
Hi, Javier. Thank you very much for sharing all your knowledge. I have a question regarding what you mentioned about scaling. How do you keep balance or set boundaries, like between this position of being a fractional, but not becoming or being perceived as an agency?
That's a good question. What's your perception on the agency world, though? I'm curious. It sounds like you have a perspective on it.
Yeah, I worked previously as an agency, and I have the intention of, or I'm exploring the pathway of doing more consulting and eventually fractional, but I don't want to scale to the point of becoming an agency. Well, due to different reasons. The fact of managing like a big team or scaling too much. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. So for me, I think about Quota as like more of like a boutique, and I think about it as like a SWAT team, right? A SWAT team that comes in and sort of like fix like big problems and kind of then goes and leaves. I take as much business. I mean, with the parameters that I'm sharing with you, I take enough business to make the money that I want, but where I don't need to hire kind of tens of people. I've tried a lot of things, and I think I've shared a couple of things with you guys. But in 2021, I tried the agency model, and I hired a couple of account executives that were selling on our behalf, and we would bring them into a company and say, like, I'll manage them. They're going to sell for you. And it didn't work. And so I don't like that model, and I try to stay away from it. And the way I do that is through like structuring agreements where it's like, here's what I'm going to offer. I'm very predictive about like the hours I'm going to spend with you, and here's the outcome that you're going to receive. So when companies come and ask me like, hey, can you hire like a couple of salespeople and you manage them, or can you bring me those types of people? You just have to set the right boundaries, as you mentioned, and say no. I say no a lot. And that's the only way for me to be able to keep focus and like stay, kind of delivering on my promise. Because the minute that you start, getting too ambitious and start bringing in more people to help you execute on your tasks, you're also diluting the quality. Most of the people pay me or Quota, the Fanny is point, because they want my experience. They want access to what I know, and at this point, like my pattern recognition. At one point in time, you guys are gonna have a lot of pattern recognition. For example, for me, if I've seen 50 sales teams in the last 3.5 years, I can walk into a company and know very specifically like what's happening. And most companies will pay for precision and for velocity. Like they want you to act fast. And you can't do that within an agency model. And an agency model, it's so dilutive from a quality standpoint, because you might as well just go and hire like a full-time person that goes and sells, because it's going to take them 3 months to learn that process. What I sell is like that. I don't need to like spend 3 months learning your product or your process. And I'm able to do that because I'm very niche about my my offering, which is answering the question that Pedro had earlier on. So I think
Awesome. Thanks.
my thing, it's probably more on the lines of like learning to say no.
All right. Gotcha.
And another thing I'll share also is, Fanny, you sort of asked this earlier, but as you guys get more popular, you can start charging more. So eventually you're going to be able to make more money. But what I advise you guys against is, trying to get your first couple of agreements to pay you $15,000 a month, because that's not going to happen.
That's amazing. Thanks, Javier. I want to be respectful of your time also. We have a little more time, so if there's a last question.
There's two in the chat.
Oh.
First of all, I want to say a big shout out to Eduardo Molina, a good friend. And I'm happy to work discounts for you guys from the Landa community if you guys are looking to take the course. And then Alfredo, any tips or recommendations for tackling larger companies? For example, P&G. So the thing with larger companies, and Alfredo, feel free to tell me your experience, but is that there's a long sales cycle. And so, for example, if I were like in Fanny's shoes, you're just starting out, and Fanny, I don't know if you have a full-time job and you're making the transition, but like, if I'm in your shoes and I'm selling into P&G, it's going to take you another 6 months to like close that deal. And I've always been against that. From a starting point, I think that what you can do, and it's something that we sell, kind of our offer as part of the services that we when we work with enterprise sales cycles, is that you have to have some sort of like a mutual action plan. A mutual action plan essentially sets certain dates and goals that you have to accomplish in order for the deal to be done. And so that way, based off your experience, for example, you can come to P&G and say like, listen, I've worked with you guys in the past, or companies of your size. I know that we probably have to go through an evaluation committee. We probably have to go through legal. We have to go through compliance, et cetera, et cetera. Let's set up some dates so we can solve, kind of for a specific time by which when we want to solve this by. And I think you also have to find your compelling event. Your compelling event in sales is just like, when do you want to solve this by? And so, for example, if they're trying to, Alfredo, what's your consulting practice specialty on? Sales, marketing?
Normally is product market fit.
Product market fit, okay.
So I wanted to make an example really fast. So, for example, someone I know in Oxo wants to launch a new digital product and then want to hire a big, McKinsey and charge $1 million in 1 year for a PDF, right? So that's what all these companies are trying to lay off the traditional consulting firms. So this is not more of a fractional CEO, but more of like consulting from the side, like, hey, help us reach that product market fit faster. That will be the question.
Listen, thank you for saying that. Actually, I think that what you just told everyone is how much validation there is an opportunity, and everyone, kind of being or wanting to be consultants or fractional workers, because people are tired of paying McKinsey $1 million for, kind of a PowerPoint presentation. But I think that, what I would want to ask you, Alfredo, is like, if you go and have this conversation with Oxo or Grupo FEMSA, how soon do they want to solve this? And that's a question you have to ask them, right?
Okay.
And if you don't have that answer, it's tough, because what you don't want, none of you, and this is more now at this point, this is like a sales training, kind of conversation, but you don't want to go into deal chasing. When you go into deal chasing is when you're, you presented them, your services, then they tell you like, gracias, yo te llamo, or like, yo te aviso, which is the nicest way to tell you like, I'll see you never. Then you start messaging them and you're trying to figure out, et cetera, et cetera. So what you have to figure out is like, when do you want to solve this by, but also like, what's the cost of not doing anything? Because when you ask that question, you start to realize, how big is the problem. And by the way, Fanny, this is also a good one for you to think about, because if the problem is a problem that's $1 million, somebody's going to be willing to pay you $100,000, for your consulting services. But if it's a $10,000 problem, nobody's going to pay you $100,000, right? And we sidetracked a little bit, but Alfredo, I think for you, you have to be very, very methodic and, prescriptive about having a mutual action plan, so you guys can keep the deal on track once you've identified that compelling event. Otherwise, it's going to take you forever to close it, and you're going to get frustrated and find a full-time job, which is why I tried to tell everyone not to do.
Okay, thank you.
Just as a follow-up on that, Alfredo, Raimundo, who's on this call, has a lot of experience selling to big corporations. So maybe you can catch a conversation also after this. Cool. So I think we can start wrapping up. Thanks everyone for joining. This one was one of the longest ones, so a lot of value. And thanks, Javier, for your time. I hope we can do like a second version in the future. And regarding the discounts, we can talk after and see if we can come up with a code or something for people who might be interested.
Yeah, happy to. And listen, guys, even though this is hard, there's a lot of beauty in doing fractional work. You guys are going to get exposed to amazing companies. You're going to see a lot of different things. So, I mean, if I can offer any words of encouragement, I think that my career has accelerated dramatically. And, for anyone that has stayed in a company full time versus like what I've been doing, I think I have a much better experience. So I encourage all of you to keep at it. And if you have any questions, I'm always on LinkedIn, or if you want to send me an email, happy to talk to you guys.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, guys. Have a good evening. Take care.
Have a good one.